So one moment.
Hi, Bridie.
Okay, so I think we're ready to get started. So apologies for slight technical issues. So Jana has, so our first presenter is Jana, who is unfortunately sitting in a power cut. So somehow she's still connected to us through her phone. So I shall be running her PowerPoint in a moment, and you're going to have to act like Chris Whitty, Jana, and just say next slide, please, when you need me to. So Jana is someone that I met a few years ago on the Critical Realism reading group. When she was doing her PhD, her thesis was examined as the external examiner was Margaret, who thought that her work was excellent, which is high praise indeed. And she's now based at the IOE in the Leadership and Learning Department, and has been, I believe, Jana, doing some critical realist work with Don Wise.
That's correct.
So I will, without further ado, I'll introduce everyone to introducing Jana, and I'm going to try now and get her PowerPoint up. So bear with me one moment.
That's excellent.
So,
yes. So hi everyone, and thank you for having me. I did participate in the reading group a few years ago now, which I enjoyed a lot, and I thought that the course was really useful and practically relevant. So I hope that you will find the same experience this time. I'm going to talk about Margaret Archer's theory of identity formation and personal change, which in her work she refers to as personal morphogenesis. If we can go into the first slide, where I would like to give a brief outline, just to remind you, or maybe for some of you it will be some new knowledge, just to give a brief outline of a critical realist social ontology, which is the understanding of how the world is structured, because that is needed for us to understand how people then go through the process of identity change. So we have three core beliefs about social reality. Firstly is that it's stratified, which means that it consists of two distinct but interconnected levels or strata, structure and agency. Secondly is that both structure and agency have potential for causality, which means that they can produce causal effects on the world around us. Thirdly is that both structure and agency have distinct properties which are separate from each other, but which constantly interact with each other, but we can't confuse them. And that's the point that critical realists emphasize. Examples of structural properties include, for example, distribution of resources, social roles, ideologies, and individual agents. As individual agents, we have self-awareness, intentionality, identity, and reflexivity, which will be a core concept in Margaret Archer's work. We have a constant dialectical relationship between structure and agency. So on the one hand, structure influences the intentions and actions of agents and can either enable or constrain their activity. But on the other hand, agents can also respond to and negotiate structural influences. Slide 3, please. Excellent, thank you. So that was a brief outline of a critical realist social ontology, and its main achievement is that it distinguishes between structure and agency, which enables us to also make a difference between their properties and their powers. And this in turn makes it possible for us to explore how agents interact with structure, what makes this interaction possible, and what this process involves. And this is where Margaret Archer's work comes in, and her concept of reflexivity becomes central. So next slide, please. In her work, she defines reflexivity as a mental ability which is shared by all normal people to consider themselves in relation to their social context and vice versa. So it's an emergent property that agents have, which mediates the relationship between individuals and objective reality. Next slide, please, Rob. It's also important for us to understand the structure of objective reality in the way that critical realists understand it. So according to critical realism, we have three different orders in reality, which are natural, practical, and social. And as people, we constantly interact with each of these orders. In the natural, of course, because we are social, not social, physical, biological beings. So we have concerns around our health, for example, which I'll come to later. Practical realm, because we live in a material world and we rely on a wide range of practical skills. You can think cooking, you can think driving, so anything that enables us to navigate the world around us on a practical level. And of course social, because we are social creatures and we can't not participate in society, so each of us is embedded in the social order of reality. According to Archer, these three realms are sources of all human concerns. So we have, like I said, for example, in the natural realm, we have concerns about our health and bodies. In the practical realm, we care about how skilled we are, how well we perform at our jobs, for example, which is related to the social realm, where we have concerns about our identities, about our social status, our relationships and friendships. So next slide, please. The main difficulty here is that, according to Margaret Archer, it's impossible, and I think we will agree, it's impossible to address all our different concerns at the same time with equal success. So we have to decide where our priorities lie, and we have to find the right balance between them. So a simple example, which I think we can all relate to, is what we call work-life balance. How we succeed in our jobs, which is the practical order of reality, without compromising our health, which is the natural order, or our social lives, which is the social one. From my own research, I have very good examples coming from the lives of ethical consumers who, having made a commitment to a certain lifestyle, certain way of eating, have to navigate all sorts of concerns arising from each of these three realms. So, for example, as an ethical consumer, you have to closely engage with the practical order, since you have to have certain cooking skills, certain perhaps knowledge, or the ability to identify the right types of food, reading food labels. In the natural order, you have to pay attention to how your body responds to dietary changes so that you stay healthy. And of course, in the social order, you have to be able to reconcile your new lifestyle with your social responsibilities, your social commitments, being a parent, feeding your children, or as a vegan or a vegetarian, do you still go to your friends' barbecue parties, or do you still attend family Christmas dinner? So I've heard a lot of stories from my participants about how difficult it can be, especially in the countries outside the Western world, to sustain your commitment to ethical eating, as well as continue to be a socially functioning person. So in the quotes that you see on the screen, these come from my research, these come from the ethical consumers that I have interviewed, and they exemplify how ethical consumers deal with concerns arising from each of these three different realms, the practical, the natural, and the social. Okay, so maybe 10 more seconds for people to, I'm not reading them aloud, so maybe 10 more seconds for people to go through them. Okay, so next one. So we face, not just as ethical consumers, but simply as people, we face this sort of dilemmas all the time. And according to Archer, it's reflexivity that enables us to determine what we want to achieve in life, whether or not we can achieve it within our given circumstances, and how exactly we should go about achieving our goals. So reflexivity acts as a bridge between agency and structure. It enables us to consider our subjective concerns, desires, what we care about, what we want to do, in light of the context, of the objective context in which we are placed. Agents then use reflexivity to define their concerns and commitments. And in doing so, according to Archer, they shape themselves as particular persons. So this is when the process of identity formation happens, as we identify what we care about and what we want to commit to. Next slide, please. So this is in essence leads us to Archer's theory of personal identity. She defines identity as a constellation of one's ultimate concerns, which is that what we choose to care about most in life that defines who we are. As persons, we are different from each other because we care about different things and because we prioritize these things in different ways. So we might have similar concerns, but the way we go about addressing them will be different, will be unique to each of the people. So the way we see what takes priority over what will be different. And it's this unique configuration of concerns that we develop that defines our identities. So like she says, which precise balance we strike between our concerns and what precisely figures among an individual's concerns is what gives us our strict identity as particular persons. Next slide, please, Rob. And so again, reflexivity is key here because it's our reflexive capacity for deliberation that plays a key role in the process of identity formation. It enables us to define our concerns, to reflect on them, and finally choose which of them we want to be our ultimate concerns, where ultimate concerns means the ones that we prioritize over anything else, that we consider to be most important and which we want to turn into lifelong commitments. So this entire reflexive process, this property of reflexivity, kicks in the process of the internal conversation. That's another very important concept in Archer's work and in her theory of identity formation. It's very simple in the sense that we're all familiar with what it is. We all engage in this inner self dialogues, which we lead in our mind silently, during which we talk to ourselves about what happens to us. We deliberate upon events, things, circumstances. It happens in cycles in Margaret Archer's theory, and that each cycle consists of 3 stages. First is the stage where we discern what our concerns are. So we reflect upon the world and we discern things that matter to us. Then we deliberate on these concerns, which are in their incipient stage, where we evaluate them in terms of their emotional appeal. So to what extent we feel that they matter to us, their moral value, so how important they are to us, and also their practical feasibility, whether we think we can successfully address these concerns and commit to them for a long time. And then the final stage is the dedicate stage, which is where we come to reject certain concerns and endorse certain others. So some of the concerns we choose as our ultimate, and they become a defining part of our identities. And it's these acts of ordering and rejection, integration and separation, that create a self out of the raw materials of inner life. That's a quote from Archer. We have constituted ourselves by identifying the self as the being with these concerns. And now, the last step in this process of constructing our identity is to turn your ultimate concern into a commitment, into what Archer calls a life project. And here again, we engage in reflexivity because we have to consider our commitments in relation to our personal circumstances and also our social context. So the need for reflexivity never goes away. We engage in reflexivity all the time, as we have to constantly reconsider our concerns in light of the changes that take place around us and within us. And we have to almost choose them again and again and decide that we want to commit to them again and again. So the process of identities are fluid precisely because our concerns change, because our circumstances change, and our ability to address our concerns change. And that's what makes reflexivity essential to the entire process of our lives. One of the key achievements, I think, of Archer's theory of personal identity is it manages to relate these inner psychological processes, which are integral to us, forming us specific persons, this process of thinking about what we care about, how we want to achieve our goals, to the external context in which the development of a person's identity takes place. So again, it's almost like the structure and agency dimension of it is integral to the process of identity formation as well. So this is what I think makes Archer's theory of personal change, the personal morphogenesis, so attuned to and so in line with critical realist theory of social change, where these two elements, the inner and the outer, the external and the internal, are taken to be separate, but also we focus on how they constantly interact with each other and what outcomes this brings, either for ourselves as persons or for the social world that we live in. That's I think it for the theory. I have some references on the last slide, but I imagine the slides will be circulated among the group. So the key readings from Archer on which this talk is based, you will be able to access. And I am happy to answer any questions if you have any.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Jana. And that was it was really fascinating. And I thought as well the way you described people's concerns, I suppose from a critical realist perspective, you might suggest that people's concerns were transfactual, whether they end up being manifest after that process of reflexivity or discernment, liberation, and dedication. I wonder if anyone else has any questions. We haven't got any questions in the chat, but if anyone would like to ask any questions now, then that would be great. Otherwise, we'll move on. No questions? Yes, go ahead.
Hey, so the citation there from Archer that said normal people have agency, I'm wondering if there was an explanation of what an abnormal person would be who did not have agency, or what abnormal versus normal would mean, because the word normal really has always struck me as problematic.
Yes, that's a great question. This is something that I have considered myself, and I'm triggered every time I read the quote, but the quote is as it is, so I didn't want to take anything out. I think I actually have spoken about this with Margaret Archer, and the way she explains it is the term, and of course you can challenge the approach and the terminology. I don't necessarily feel comfortable with it either. But by normal, what she meant is every person who is considered a fully functioning member of society in terms of not having a mental disability or mental disorder, which would not enable him to have the similar or the same mental processes, which I have described as being essential to the process of discerning, discerning concerns, dedicating yourself to them, considering yourself in relation to the context in which you are placed. So people who would not be able to, or and another very, very important point is that reflexivity and internal conversations have not been studied at the level of minors. So we don't know much about how babies or younger children engage in those reflexive processes. So by normal people, I think what Margaret Archer means is people who are able to engage in mental processes, so they have enough level of maturity and enough appropriate psychological, physiological capacity, psychological capacity for engaging in this kind of reflexive processes. Does that make any sense?
You're absolutely, your answer makes sense, but I don't agree with it, obviously. But that comes, so yeah. But your explanation of what Archer says makes sense, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. And we've got a few questions coming in. Jana, do you have a moment, or because I know you wanted to get off by 20 past?
Yeah, I can stay for 3 more minutes, but then I really have to dash off.
Okay, so I think we'll just pick up on, there's one question here, which is, so we talked last week about the sort of, because it was the first session, we talked about the empirical, the actual, and the real. And Vani is asking, so how does this relate to the empirical, the actual, and the real? I suppose the question there really is in your research, how would you, which bits of it are empirical, which are actual, and which are real?
So this is different from empirical, actual, and real in that the empirical, actual, and real are, we use them to describe the reality outside, whereas the process of identity formation, the way I described it, is what happens within us. So the empirical, the actual, and the real Margaret Archer does not apply those terms or those concepts to her work on identity formation and identity change. Where I think it will become relevant is, of course, when you consider your circumstances. Then if you are a critical realist, then perhaps you will be able to perhaps go a bit deeper and consider not just what you see immediately, you see outside of yourselves, but also maybe deeper causal powers, which and this is where the distinction between the actual, the empirical, and the real will become relevant. But I think on the level of the average person going about their lives, trying to figure out what they care about, how they can address their concerns, and in this process becoming certain persons, I don't think that the actual, the empirical, and the real apply necessarily immediately. Those are different levels of theory. These theories address different levels of change. So the empirical, the actual, and the real is about social change, whereas identity formation and personal morphogenesis is about the individual, on the level of individual. So Margaret Archer does not apply those concepts in her work.
So I suppose, though, you are, in a way, you're describing the relationships between those different factors. But yeah, but point taken that that's not something that Archer specifically goes into. I think we've got quite a few questions coming in, which I might have a read of while we continue. But I think to get things moving, we'll say thank you very much, Jana, for that. That was really useful and a fantastic introduction to Margaret Archer's work. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed being part of the session. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I'll hand over now. I'm going to put myself on mute and hand back over to Priscilla, who's going to take over the next, just to let everyone know the rest of the session. Priscilla's now going to talk to us for about half an hour, I think. And then we've got another presentation. It's actually a recorded presentation from another critical realist. And then we'll move on to an activity at the very end that Priscilla's going to talk to us about. So over to you, Priscilla.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jana. It's lovely to hear you again. Once again, sorry, but I can't get into the, oh well. Will this...
We can see it fine, so that's, even if you can't see the full screen.
Good. We tried it this morning and it was working beautifully then, but now it won't. So I'll just have a go with it this way. So sorry, it'd be much better if it was the full screen, wouldn't it? Just isn't doing it though, sorry. Now, I am going to talk about the actual and the empirical, actual and real, and structure and agency. And I was very interested to see some of the comments in the chat. That was very useful. I'll pick up on some of them. And also, I would like to say now that Shivani said she could, or he could not download the recording, Rob, and we'll definitely check that out, because in my PowerPoint here, I've got several links that I hope you'll be able to use. There's a resource list at the end and all sorts of things that you might like to check up on later. So no, it's not moving even, Rob. So, oh, right. Is this okay? Did it move?
Yes, that's fine. You've moved on.
Good. Okay then. Right. Agency. So I'm going to look at different views of agency. And the first is agency is the activity of conscious, intentional, embodied, unique human agents. And if you're going to be a firefighter, you've got to be very aware of your brave decision, your courage, and the limits of your body and what might happen to it, haven't you? A second view is that individual agents interact with one another and with social structures. Our agency often has unintended, unwanted effects. Our conscious decisions are informed and constrained by other people and contexts and by our subconscious. So agency is much more complicated than the first view. And then moving into further complications. Oh dear, it's not even moving down now. Oh, good. Towards postmodernism and Picasso, there are ideas that agency doesn't start or finish within any individual agent. It's orchestrated within narrative structures. Character isn't real. There's no single author when we do something, always multiple authors of agency. Agency is never a property and is always relational, in between, dispersed, interacting with other people in our context all the time. And I wonder which of these ideas of agency fit your idea of yourself and your activities. Now, to go a bit further on with agency and structure, and to look at some of the research paradigms before critical realism, to start with positivism, Durkheim, Parsons, there's a great tendency to do mass surveys. And as you can see from the spreadsheet, thousands of anonymous individual agents who answered the questionnaires are grouped under variables such as family, diet, and really there's a great emphasis on how our surrounding structures organize our lives with little thought of individual agents. There's little thought of the embodied person, our motives, our intentions, our individual values, and our complexity. However, in the interpretivist paradigms following Weber, Giddens, here agents are central. As the little picture denotes, the researcher's attention is on the people and their interactions with their context and environment in the background, important but less so. And this is about, whereas the first was about determinism, how structures shape our lives, this is more about voluntarism and how we are strong agents within weaker structures. A third approach, various kinds of post-structural, postmodern approaches. There's Foucault with power in discourse, but there's no clear agents or motives. Foucault was also concerned about how micro-technologies affect our agency. He loved Bentham's picture here of the prison, the great circular prison, with the guards in the centre hidden inside their watchtower, and the prisoners in cells all round the outside, so that the guards could watch their every movement. Very questioning ideas about structure and agency. Moving on to postmodernism, and many of you will have probably come across actor network theory, Latour, Oswell and others, and they see dispersed agency. We are orchestrated within narrative structures. Agents are assemblages of all sorts of external things, and they see objects as having agency and being actants. Now, a fourth approach to structure and agency, which is more the critical realism approach, but there are great overlaps and varieties. Structure, agency, interaction shapes human life and society. Structures precede and outlast agents that can only be enacted through human agency. Hospitals are an example. They're just empty buildings until the agents turn them into healthcare services and give them meaning. structures are determining, they're very influential and powerful, but they're not determinist. They don't decide finally what happens, because they compete in open systems of many forces. And so critical realism is neither voluntarism, free agents, or determinism, strong structures, but the interaction, the dialectic that Jana was talking about. And our own motives and reasons can also be powerful causal mechanisms in our agency. But our agency is very limited because we live in conditions of not of our choosing. We're thrown into contexts like when we're born or when we suddenly arrive at university. And our actions often have unintended, counterproductive, unwanted, unpredicted effects. And when we have choices, rather than often making the best choice, we may be faced with what's the least harmful choice to make. Now, Douglas Purpura, the critical realist, identified 4 kinds of structures as causal mechanisms. The first kind of structure he saw as aggregate or group behavior created by many, many individual agents, stable over time. And an obvious example is economics. Selfish individuals all searching for profit are sustain the markets according to them. The second is law-like regularities that govern, explain, determine social behaviours. So they appear in, say, Parsons' book, The Social System, or Piaget's biological unfolding of child development, or the cohorts, which really are rather determinist in how our, the variables all around us shape our lives. Now, a third kind of structure are structures as rules and resources that we agents draw on to shape our lives. And that's particularly obvious in Giddens' structuration theory and voluntarism. Agents are more in charge. But the fourth one, the critical realism idea of structure and agency, is of powerful, enduring systems and positions, these structures. They exist in and through human social relations, but they far precede and outlast agents. And we don't individually construct them, although we constantly reproduce and resist, modify and interact with them. And as you can see, the World Wide Web, for example, is a massive structure which many, many people have constructed and keep running, and we all interact with, and which hugely open up our lives and enrich them in many ways and complicate them too. And you might be liking to think which model you prefer to work on. Oh dear, I'm sorry, I've just realized that my electricity thing isn't working properly. Just oh dear. There we are. Right, so the next now onto the empirical, actual and real, which people were asking about, and just to quickly whiz down the agency column. So in the empirical of our agency, that's mainly our inner thoughts, beliefs and feelings. And then on the actual agency, that's our activities, interactions, relationships, chains of events, the interaction between us and the external in some ways. And finally, the real agency, well, our agency is shaped by our genes, the environment, our reasons for acting, our motives, also by social context and by our ethnicity, gender, class, age, health, income, place, all sorts of things are powerful causal influences on our agency now and over the future. To think about those 3 in relation to agency structure, empirically, there are our experience of the social and natural structures and how we interpret them and how they enable, constrain or confuse our agency and our decision making. And also, as Jana has said, our inner conversations. And by the way, Margaret Archer have 4 kinds of conversations. The one where we just go and do things, the ones where we discuss quite a lot, the ones where we go on and on round in circles. Academics tend to like this. Shall I do it on the one hand this, on the other hand that? And then the 4th one is the fractured agency of very distressed people who just cannot have a conversation that leads somewhere. And this has been very useful, I've found, with my students who have been studying young people with mental health problems. On the actual structure agency, there are our interactions with social and natural structures. And of course, there are the actual social structures that exist through agency. And for the real, the causal mechanisms that drive our lives, social and natural structures and psychological agents interact. I want to quickly read you a little example, and I'd like you to be thinking of where agency works and where structures work in this example. I hope it's moved on, has it, Rob?
Yes, yeah, you're all good.
Great. So Raquel Nelson, she was convicted of reckless conduct and jaywalking. She and her 3 children had been shopping, and they had to wait 90 minutes between 2 buses on their journey home. They alighted from the bus opposite their flat, but in between was a 5-lane highway with the nearest safe crossing half a mile away. So they decided to cross the highway. Raquel's 4-year-old son was killed by a driver who admitted to being partially blind and under the influence of alcohol and pain medication. Although this was his 3rd hit-and-run conviction, the driver received a shorter prison sentence than Raquel Nelson's 3 years. She was convicted of vehicular homicide, though she has never had a car, and of crossing the street other than at a crosswalk. The authorities had ignored local residents' repeated requests for a marked crossing and a lower speed limit. As an African American, Raquel Nelson was not convicted by her peers, but by middle-class white jurors who did not use buses. You can see more details on the link, and you might later on like to discuss this or think about it and note the structure and agency interplay. So I see structure and agency as a dialectic. Do rivers shape landscapes, or landscapes shape rivers? Agents are shaped and reshaped by structures, and they reshape structures through social processes, through a dialectic in time and space. And sometimes, just as the river hits the dam, the agents hit a huge change in their life, a huge challenge. Now, just as Margaret Archer talks about morphogenesis, Roy Basker talked about transformational model of social activity. So you have society, the individual, and the constant interaction when we're in society and being socialized. And when as individuals we reflect and reproduce and transform our experiences, and then again we're socialized. And this happens from many different directions all the time, all through our lives. Again, raising questions about how much we are a consistent, coherent individual over our whole lifetime. Some people say we change and become different people over our lives. Again, structure and agency can only exist in relation to each other. They're separate but interacting. They're partly overlapping, but they are irreducible. They can't be collapsed into each other. Without values and resources from structures to enable us to make sense of experience, agency would be empty or chaotic, meaningless, overwhelming. Agents live in competing structures in open systems, many competing different influences. And these independent, intransitive structures interact with our transitive responses. Now, another thing that Margaret talked about in relation to structure and agency, some people have downward conflation, where structures determine what we do. Some people think of upward conflation, where we orchestrate the structures. Then there's central conflation, Giddens' approach, where structure and agency merge and are mutually constituted. And that also happens in realist evaluation, rather. And Margaret says we should avoid all these three conflations and see structure and agents as separate, distinct, but always interacting, rather like the river and the landscape. And to Douglas Popora, a critical realist, agency means meaningful causal power, informed by human intention and purpose, oriented to and evaluated by future effects. I was quite surprised then, but I've realized more and more that everything we do, think and say is actually organized towards the future. And this confusion about tense and merging and conflation and so on raises all sorts of complicated questions about how we can research and understand them. Margaret Archer also introduced culture as a third very, very important element. I won't go into that now. And as for morphogenesis, as Jana discussed, I thought you just might like to know that morph comes from form, shape, or structure. Stasis, of course, from static, and morphogenesis from change. And it's that difference between being static and being changing that is so interesting. Now, Christian Smith, another critical realist, I think 2010, wrote this book, What is a Person? I'm not going to go through his 30 human capacities, but I've listed them here for people who are very interested in agency to think about how much they think they're important as part of our being human, more of them, ending with love. Now, somebody mentioned earlier, are children agents and can they do internal conversations and so on? I'm very, very interested in babies as agents and what counts as human. And is human morality all learned, acquired? And that would mean, is it synthetic, not actually integral to us, our nature? Or are we born with an innate sense of right and wrong, justice and injustice, kindness and unkindness, helping or hindering? And do we have an innate fear of cruelty and unfairness? Now, if you do look at this link, it's a 5-minute video of babies watching the researcher playing with fluffy toys. Sometimes the toys are nice to each other and sometimes they're nasty to each other. And from 3 months, by microsecond analysing the baby's gaze by videos, the researchers find that the babies are really like the puppets being nice to each other, and they're not at all pleased about the puppets being unhelpful to each other. It's a gorgeous video if you want to look at it and are interested in babies and personhood. And also Paul Bloom's book. And Tamaki, who is going to speak later on, she and I have written a paper together about when agency begins. Now, also, there's the work of Dave Eldevas, some of you may be familiar with, on structure and agency, and how language confers an enhanced capacity to communicate and so affects the ontology of the human, and as does ethics. And he's written these 2 books on social structures. He's also written a book about ANT, actor network theory, and critical realism, how they challenge one another and what we can learn from both of them. And also Dave has written very useful short blogs. So if you start searching for him on the internet, if you click, for instance, on what is humanity, it's just a page and it's just full of really useful ideas. Now, Chris Yates also said to me, it's worth mentioning 2 books on international relations, because of course, it's too easy to look at structure and agency in terms of individuals, but we also ought to look at intergenerational, international relations as well. And the first book on critical realism looks at how great thinkers of the past have got things wrong, and how critical realism can help them to research better on ethics and politics. And the second book also thinks that because a lot of international relations researchers don't look seriously enough at cause, the real in the empirical action and real is what she means. She thinks that international relations research is in an appalling state, and it's time to shift the background discourse. And she thinks that critical realism can help for better research about peace and conflict studies and related fields. So for those people interested, might like to look up those 2 books. My last 2 slides are of references, lots of them. I won't go through them now, but there is an activity for you to do either in the breakout groups later or on your own, that you might like to do on paper or on your screen, filling in the 2 columns on where you think themes in your own research fall under structure or under agency. And now I'll hand you back to Rob.
Thanks very much, Priscilla. That was great. Could you just stop sharing your screen, and then we'll be back. There we go. Thanks very much. So there would, that was really useful and covered a huge amount of ground. There were a few questions that have come up in the chat just while Priscilla was talking, so I'll just try and address some of them. There was, in fact, one that didn't come up, but I think that we just need to, because we glossed over it quite quickly last week, was Priscilla mentioned about open systems. And I just want to quickly talk about that. And Priscilla, please jump in here if you want to add anything. But just to say that we generally, as social scientists, are dealing with society, which is an open system. So it's maybe easier to tell you what that is not. And that's if you were a chemist working in a lab and you were trying to do experiments, you'd be trying to create a closed system as best as you could. So you might be creating a reaction inside a test tube so that the glass of the test tube is blocking all other interactions from whichever chemicals you're working with. Obviously, as social scientists, that's not possible. There are always multiple factors interacting with what we're looking at. So in an open system, that is an open system. So there are all these different factors at play. And this relates to a question that's come up, which was someone was asking, saying that they're unclear what we're talking about when we're talking about dialectic. And we'll just as a quick overview before I get on to the final stages, that when we talk about dialectic, I'll situate this within critical realist research. Some people talk about 3 phases of critical realism. So the first phase is defining the empirical, the actual, and the real. And by phases of critical realism, we're really talking about Roy Bhaskar's work over the years. And as is already coming up, there are people that disagree. There are disagreements within critical realism. But the first phase of critical realism is talking about the empirical, the actual, and real generative mechanisms that we talked about last week. The next phase of critical realism, which got a few of the books here, is dialectic. And dialectic is Roy Bhaskar's the Dialectic Repulsive Freedom is one of his he wrote many books, this is one of the big books. And dialectic is exactly as Priscilla's just been describing. There is a dialectic between structure and agency that Roy describes within the transformational model of social activity. But you can also get dialectics between any other number of interacting factors. And from that is what emerges, what Roy Bhaskar refers to as the pulse of freedom or creativity. And the third round, I'm not going to go into details on this, but the third phase of critical realism is talking about meta-reality. There's another book called Meta-reality. Meta-reality takes develops that idea, but starts to talk about how, in fact, true reality is not dialectic. And I'm not going to go into any detail on that, but Priscilla and I have had a long ongoing conversation about the nature of love over the last couple of weeks for something that I'm working on. And there is a suggestion that love is meta-reality because it's not dialectic. It's a singular force as opposed to a dialectic force. So that's what we're talking. So dialectic is a phase of critical realism, and it's a way of understanding the world. Now I'm going to stop now again, but I'm going to try and put on I'm putting on another. So I'm just getting a PowerPoint working, which is about to disappear. Sorry. So I'm putting on another PowerPoint. So this is
Rob. Could I just interrupt with one thing? And there was one question. What is stratified reality? And that is the empirical, the actual, and the real, because they're stratas or levels. They're called depth reality rather than flat reality, which most researchers work with. Okay.
That's great. Thanks, Priscilla. I've not seen that one, so thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I'm now going to introduce Tamaki Yoshida is now going to present a PowerPoint to us. She's actually recorded it in advance because she's based in Japan, so the time difference was too much for her to join us live. So I'll turn up my volume, and she speaks quite quietly, so hopefully you can hear properly. But Tamaki was one of Priscilla's PhD students, and in fact joined Priscilla many years ago. I think about 10 years ago, you said, Priscilla. And so started working with critical realism around the same time that Priscilla also started working. So in many ways, they sort of learnt critical realism together. I'll let her speak for herself. She carried out some research in Tanzania looking at schools and structure and agency within schools. So without further ado, I'm going to try and share her PowerPoint. It's 10 minutes long. And so when we come back, it will be about just past 7 o'clock, and we'll move into final activity. Okay, so here is Tamaki, if I can get started.
Hello, my name is Tamaki Yoshida. I'd like to talk about structure and agency using examples from my doctorate. Research on physical punishment of children in schools in Tanzania, which I did more than 10 years ago, supervised by Priscilla. I'd like to note that I did not plan to use critical realism at the beginning, but as I had developed my understanding of it, I found it very useful for my research because it helped me to analyze and understand how structure and agency influenced each other without having to reduce the world or ontology to our knowledge of it. So objects are not reduced to directly observable objects or events. They are not fixed either, but can also be a process without having to lose possible causality. I say possible causality because its influence may be debated and or not activated, but its ontology is not. So the photo shows a classroom environment of one of the schools I visited. There were over 100 students in one class. The room was packed, as you can see. and it was very uncomfortable to sit for hours, especially when it was hot, humid, and dark when rain. The observable material black is an example of structures of inequality or poverty. Teachers and adults often associated poverty or economic inequalities with students' misbehaviors. But teachers did not immediately justify the use of corporal punishment. Many teachers recognized the importance of talking through to benefit the child and to have things changed for them. But they also had mixed feelings about unequal child-adult relationships and changing such relations mainly due to poverty. The difficulties associated with not having enough resources. Pedagogy usually involved recalling facts in the crowded classroom, sharing a textbook with other students. The students studied very hard, and teachers tried their best to help them prepare for national examinations. National examinations were seen as a measurement of successful schooling. Teachers tried to make lessons more interesting from time to time by using jokes or props that they brought from home and occasionally changing seating arrangements to face each other in small groups instead of all facing the boards in a row. By the way, it was also a practical solution to share one textbook amongst several students. Anyway, teachers recognized the importance of having a friendly relationship with children, but that conflicted with the methods that they used to monitor and control students. The necessity to control students seemed to be taken for granted as of life. So teachers as well as students experienced and reproduced adult-centered perspectives. For example, students often saw themselves as incompetent future adults or tomorrow's nation who will be responsible for caring for elderly adults, elderly parents. Children and adults often took adult-centered perspectives for granted, thereby reproducing unequal relations. One student explained how she and her friends share work at home to help their parents in order to spend more time with them. She also said that they wouldn't do it without their parents, denying their own willingness to help. Explaining about her younger sister who refused to help, she also seemed to suggest the lesser moral status of the younger child. Students participated in school and family context, and their responsibilities were often taken for granted and without positive acknowledgement or explicit appreciation. In school, students clean their classrooms, school ground, teachers' room, toilets, and other school premises. They also prepared water for teachers' tea. At home, they washed their clothes by hand, helped with dishes, fetched water, and so on. They understood such activities as their responsibility and explained how they felt good about it afterwards. One student explained how she recognized her own initiative to respect others by offering help to others. and indicated that children do not just obey adults just because they are under control. But in school, teachers and some school prefects were walking around with sticks in their hands to monitor and control while the students cleaned. It seemed that there was not much room for recognition and encouragement of agency there. So there was continuous feedback between the agents and agents in structures. The examples I used mainly focused on agency reproducing structures and structure operating through human agency. But agency does not just reproduce, but could also adjust or change structures. Well, I think I'm going to end here. So I hope it would help. Thank you very much for listening and for your time. Okay, bye.
Okay, so I hope that quite a few people left during that, so I'm assuming that some people were struggling to hear it, but I hope that some people managed to. Priscilla, I haven't had a chance to look through the questions. Is there anything that you'd like to address, to bring up?
I didn't. I think we've covered everything. Does anybody want to raise their hand though? That please, you have a link to the Tamaki's research. Yes. Now that I put several ones at the end of my PowerPoint under references, and I wonder if the PowerPoint can be sent to people. Can it, Rob, or not?
I'll see what I can do. What might be easier is if we put together a list of references, and I'll put them in. When I send the link to the video of today, I'll include a list of references.
Oh, okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll go through my PowerPoint and pick out the links, explain what they are, put the references as a resource for you to use as you want to do, including the baby video. I'll do that, Rob.
Great, that would be fantastic. Thank you. And I'll send that out in the next couple of days. So I think without further ado, we'll get on to the final task, which is we're going to put you into breakout rooms. And if people could just have a think about what structure and agency means for your research. So are there different categories of your research that you might put on one side or the other? I personally found it with my PhD research was very useful using specifically the TMSA, the diagram that Priscilla showed you of society and individuals and how they interact, and what that means. It means you can bring those two things together in a way that's not that's often not very comfortable with other aspects of research. So Priscilla mentioned Giddens' structuration theory, which, if you're interested in that, Margaret Archer has a very interesting critique of Giddens' structuration theory, and there are a few other references to it in other books. So if anyone's interested, then feel free to reach out to me. But I'm now going to put everyone into breakout rooms. So have a discussion with the people that you find yourself with. I'll try and put you in about 5 people per room. And
Rob,
yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I expect you might be doing this, but are you going to talk about time? For instance, would people say like a quarter of an hour, do you think?
Well, I was going to do quarter of an hour or 10 minutes. Should we do meet in the middle? Should we do 12.5 minutes?
Whatever you think, yeah.
Okay, so we'll meet back in about 12.5 minutes. I'll put you into breakout rooms. Priscilla and I will join you, and we will have a bit of a discussion about structure and agency. So, and if you've got any questions off the back of that, then either write them in the chat or be ready to speak out when we rejoin. So I'm just going to put you in breakout rooms now. So I think those still here, you've got to click to join the breakout rooms. we're just waiting a minute. In 15 seconds, everyone will be back in the room. There's just a bit of a delay.
Well, others are joining in. It's been a fantastic session today.
Okay, I think everyone's nearly everyone's back. Just waiting for. I think everyone's back now. So I'm sorry that I kept appearing in your rooms and just lurking, but everyone seemed to be having such good chats that I didn't want to interrupt people. Was there anything? Did anyone have any questions that they'd like to raise before we wrap up? Anything that came up? Yeah, Bridie, you're on mute, Bridie.
Can I just say, we were interrupted at the end and we were just wanting to make some connections with email. So it's just about different people, if they want to pick up people's emails to kind of continue a discussion about the research they're doing, because the 14 minutes go by so quickly and we don't always get the chance to, you know, discuss further. So it's just kind of facilitating that if possible. I know there is a problem about sharing emails, you know, in terms of GDP, but there's any way of doing it?
So I suppose well, I think there's two things to address that. I think the first thing, Brad, is I probably realised from the conversations that were going on now that we weren't sure how the breakout rooms would work. But I think next week we'll give you much more time in the breakout rooms because it seems that people were chatting. So we'll give you much more time in the breakout rooms next week. If people are happy to share email addresses in the chat now, then that would be one way of sharing them. If you've got a specific request that you want to pass your email on to someone else, then if you'd like to email it to me, I can probably pass that on because you've given me your permission to share it. But other than that, it would be, please don't all swamp me with your emails. Now I've said that. So probably best if you want to put your emails in the chat now, if there's anyone who you specifically want to carry on the conversation with. Or if there is anyone who was just cut off in the middle of sharing an email or anything, then now would be the moment to unmute, shout out, and we'll just make that connection. So, Bridie, was there anyone in particular that you were trying to catch?
It was Francis. We were just about to sort of agree to whether we want to continue our conversation about our research. So I've just put mine in the chat for Francis. If Francis is still there, I don't know, but I'm happy to.
I've got it. Thank you.
Okay, Francis, great
Brilliant.
stuff.
Okay, that's done.
Yeah.
So and any other than email addresses, anyone, or well, as well as email addresses, do shout out now if there's anyone else that you've missed and you want to catch. Otherwise, did anyone have anything that they wanted to pick up on? And if not, Priscilla, do you want to just?
Rob, sorry, I had a question. Where do physical bodies fit into this agency and structure dialectic? So I'm doing a study looking at people who are living in poverty and their experiences of accessing healthcare and medicines. And it's an ethnographic study. We're following people up over a year. And it just seems like that they have like injuries and illnesses and family members' illnesses and stuff, like their physical bodies are kind of acting as a constraint on their agency in a kind of unexpected way over time.
Yeah, I think I think I'm going to pass this on to Priscilla, because I think speaking about, well, Priscilla and I actually were talking earlier in the week about the you know, what are we talking about if we're not talking about bodies? But Priscilla, do you want to just address that? If you're still there, you're on mute and we can't see you. Cool.
I am here. I'm sorry. What exactly was the question? I was also looking at the chat, I'm afraid, in case.
Sorry. So I think the question was, where do physical bodies fit into this?
Oh, physical bodies. Yes. Terribly important. I think the best answer I can give is that we're soon going to do a session on the 4 planes of social being, and that starts with physical bodies. So we'll give physical bodies a really good go in that session. I hope that's enough for now.
Great, thank you.
And just to forewarn you, actually, because Priscilla and I were talking about the 4 planes of social being, and a couple of weeks ago, and I've always struggled with it because there's a diagram that appears in all the books about the 4 planes of social being that I've never really managed to get my head around very well. And Priscilla gave me the confidence to recognise that actually you can understand it without. So if like me, you can't get your head around the diagram, I think don't despair, because there are some diagrams that are sometimes quite complicated, and actually the reality is often a bit more simple than the diagram always shows. But yes, so we'll be discussing that later. But as Priscilla has often made the point that bodies are fundamental, and if we're doing social research, really, what are we talking about if we're not talking about bodies? So thanks for that question. And sorry, go on, Priscilla.
Another thing is open and closed systems. Again, I'm glad someone picked it up. I was conscious we were skimming over it, and we're going to deal with that much more too in the 4 planes of social being.
And I think this is early on. There are, as we mentioned about last week, there's a new language to learn here, and so we're at the very early stages. But hopefully things will become clearer. And if you've got any questions, then you can email us. I think you've got both. You should have access to both of our email addresses. So do email, and also save up the questions for the next session. So I'm sure that, to use a critical realist term, that questions will emerge as you sort of put these ideas down, which is when ideas tend to emerge. I think we're now on 7:30, so I think we'll finish there. I'll leave this call open for a bit. So if people do want to keep putting emails in there or copying emails down, then fine. I'll actually shut it down in 5 minutes. So I'm gonna disappear now. And very good, great to see so many of you again this week, and look forward to seeing you next week. So thanks very much.
Yes, and thank you so much. Thank you for the heart, Josie.